Hello. We have studied block ciphers. So we understood how we designed them, and we've seen many examples of block ciphers, the most used standards, and so on. Then we have seen the mode of operation, because we said that you have to use a mode of operation in order to use a block cipher. But now it is time to analyze block cipher. So this is the place where we discuss why a block cipher is secure and how can you attack it. Okay, so we are going to talk about block cipher cryptanalysis. So in the rest of this part, you can still think that we are focusing on a single block because it is easier to evaluate encryption of a single block. Okay. So first I will start with introduction. So I will give some basic definitions that we use in cryptanalysis. And then I will show an example of a differential cryptanalysis attack on a cipher, which you already know, present. Then I will talk about complexities. What will be the data complexity, time, memory complexity of an attack, and then discuss the success probability of a cryptanalysis scenario. Okay. So let's start with some basic definitions. So we have some different attack types, but generally when we say an attack, the first thing that comes to our mind is total break. In that scenario, attacker recovers the key. Since this is the only thing that's a secret in a block cipher or in any symmetric key encryption algorithm, this is the main focus of the attacker, right? So the attacker tries to recover the key. But there are different ways to break a cipher, like global deduction. In this scenario, the attacker finds an algorithm A that is functionally equivalent to either encryption with the secret key K or decryption with the secret key K, but the attacker still don't know what the K is. Okay. Local deduction is a somewhat smaller version of this. So the attacker still cannot capture the secret key, but the attacker can generate the plain text corresponding to a previously unseen ciphertext or vice versa. Okay. The fourth thing that I'm going to talk about is the distinguishing algorithm, or sometimes called the distinguishing attack. So in this scenario, the attacker can effectively distinguish between two black boxes. One black box is the block cipher with the randomly chosen key or a secret key that you don't know, and the randomly chosen permutation. So we are going to give you a box which takes input and gives you output. And for instance, assume that that box takes input as 128 bits and produces 108-bit outputs. And I'm going to ask you, is this just a random permutation, or is this a yes with a secret key that you don't know? So if you can distinguish this, of course, I set the block size to make things simpler, but the black box will actually give any output when you give any input. Okay, so the distinguishing algorithm is really important. So generally, if a cipher is good, we cannot distinguish it from a random looking permutation, right? So actually, everything starts with every attack starts with a distinguisher. So this is why we first understand what the distinguishing attack is. Then maybe we can convert it into a total break. So the cryptanalyst always tries to find a distinguisher. Okay, so for the rest of this course, this is the thing you have to remember. Okay, everything starts with a distinguisher. And by randomly chosen permutation, we just say that again, if our block size is 128 bits, just assume that we randomly chose a permutation that takes 128 bits input and maps it to a 128-bit output. Okay, this is a permutation, right? So question is, can you distinguish it from a block cipher? And we will talk, so this is actually, most of the time we cannot distinguish it with probability 1. So there will be some probability involved. So actually, almost all of our attacks will be statistical attacks, okay? Things will work with some probability. Okay, so let's talk about data types. So when you perform cryptanalysis, there are some data that you can capture, okay? We always assume that the communication channel is insecure, right? So the attacker always captures their ciphertext. So if you can break the cipher from those ciphertexts, then we will call it a ciphertext only attack. But then There are some, sometimes you have more ability like non-plain text, where you know some plain text and corresponding ciphertext. And maybe you have more ability like chosen plain text. In this scenario, you still know some plain text and ciphertext, corresponding ciphertext, but you have some ability to choose the plain text. So you might say that, okay, I want some plain text, but they should be in this form, okay? So the last thing I'm going to talk about is adaptively chosen plain text. I will actually explain them in the following slides one by one. But in this scenario, you actually have some chosen plain text and corresponding ciphertext. You perform some operations on them. And depending on the result, you ask for more. So you're actually performing your attack in an adaptive way. Okay. So as you can see, the scenario becomes unrealistic when you move from top to the bottom, because the top is the easiest, the more realistic scenario, but the attack will be harder there. But in the bottom, it is more unrealistic, but the attacker have more ability there. So the attacks will be most probably better there because the attacker have more ability. So collecting data becomes harder as we move down the list. Okay. So let's briefly mention once again all of them. Let's look at ciphertext-only attacks. So in this scenario, the attacker has access only to the ciphertext. Okay. Since the communication is assumed to be performed on an insecure channel, this is the most realistic scenario. So maybe if it is wireless communication, maybe you have an antenna and maybe you listen to the communication for 50 years and you collected a lot of ciphertext and you're hoping that one day there will be a weakness in the cipher or you will capture a lot of ciphertext so that somehow you can break it. To perform a ciphertext-only attack, the cipher should have significant weaknesses. For example, RC4 or A51, where the key size is short and so on. Okay, so don't expect to perform ciphertext-only attacks on modern ciphers. Okay, they are designed in a nice way, so most probably it wouldn't work. Okay, so let's focus on things that we are actually going to do or what cryptanalysis do. So second type of attacks are non-plain text attacks. It is assumed that the attacker can get n plain text and the corresponding ciphertext. So that's it. You don't have any control over what the plain text or ciphertext is. You don't know in what form they will be, but you get n plain text blocks, let's say, and then corresponding ciphertext blocks. This scenario is realistic in practice because the attacker may guess some blocks of the plain text. This is always possible. For instance, if it is an email and if it is encrypted, you can easily guess beginning headers. So this way you can actually capture beginning block and, since you already captured the ciphertext block, so you can guess some plain text blocks from the context. Moreover, you can also trick the key holder to encrypt a document which is known by the attacker. So this will also apply to chosen plain text scenario. And actually this happens in the past. In history we have examples. For instance, during the Second World War, Americans asked some Japanese spies to, work for them. So asked for secret documents. So Japanese, some spies actually first denied this request, then they gave them a document, but said that, okay, this is a very secret document. Don't send it as a plain text to the United States. Send it in an encrypted way. So they encrypted the document and sent it from Japan to the United States. So Americans thought that this was a secret document, but actually the document was forged. So it has no importance. But the plain text was generated by Japanese people. And since you encrypt it and send it to the United States, they listen to the communication. So they already know the plain text and also the ciphertext. But more importantly, again, the last one might sound somewhat unrealistic, but this is what happens in practice. And this actually will apply to all of the following attack types. So the attacker may capture the device to provide any plain text and store the corresponding ciphertext. So this actually happens. For instance, you capture the mobile phone, but it is the disk is encrypted. So you cannot, decrypt anything on the disk, but you can call the encryption algorithm. The secret key is inside the device, so you cannot remove it. And you cannot also tamper it because they are tamper-proof. They will erase the key from the memory when you try to capture it. There are some techniques. If you use a little bit acid, maybe you can break that part. But a little bit acid is very, risky sentence, because if you put a little bit more, the acid will destroy the chip and you will lose everything. So you cannot do this on real data. But anyway, since you cannot capture the key, but you have the device, you can give the input as anything you want, and you get this ciphertext. So most of the time, capturing the device is not that unrealistic, and in some scenarios, you already have the device. For instance, if you buy a gaming console, let's say, you already have the device with you, or if you have a smart card, you have the smart card, right? So you already have the device. So this scenario is not that unrealistic. Okay, chosen plaintext attacks. The attacker is able to request the encryption of n plaintext of their choosing and captures the corresponding ciphertext. So it is like the previous one, but in this case, you actually request plaintext in some formats. Okay. More unrealistic compared to non-plaintext attacks. However, there are many examples in the history, but again, as I said, if you have the device, then you already have control on the plaintext, right? So this way, this attack works. So actually, you might ask why I need to choose plaintext. For instance, if your attack requires input with low weight, which means many zeros and a small number of ones, then you may need to, choose your plaintext. But in practice, generally, we talk about chosen plaintext attacks when we talk about differential cryptanalysis. In that scenario, we don't care about what the plaintext is, but we want to make a small modification to it, like flipping 1 or 2 bits, and then request that encryption. So this is what you are choosing, actually. So you don't actually say what the plaintext will be, but you're only saying that, okay, give me m plaintext, but also flip this many bits of all of these m plaintexts and also give their encryption to me. So this is what we will see in differential cryptanalysis. Okay, the final one is adaptively chosen plaintext attacks. The attacker is able to request encryptions of some plaintext, possibly seeing encryptions of some plaintext first and making some calculations using them. So depending on the result, you will ask a special type of plaintext. This is why we are saying it's adaptively chosen plaintext. Of course, I always talk about plaintext, but you can reverse the definitions. You can perform a chosen ciphertext attack, adaptively chosen ciphertext attack, and so on. So this is more unrealistic compared to other types, but again, if you capture the device, then you can still perform this attack. Okay. All right. So we're actually talking about the capabilities of the attacker. In other words, what kind of data that they can capture. Now let's talk about resource types. So the success of an attack is measured according to the resources it uses, right? One of them is time. So this we will call it time complexity. So it is the time or effort required to perform the attack. So if the attack is really fast, sometimes you measure it in seconds, saying that on this laptop, I performed the attack in like 5 minutes or something. But if it is more theoretical attack, you will say things like, okay, these attacks work if you can perform, for instance, 2 to the 100 encryptions and so on. Okay, so you can measure it with respect to time or number of operations that you need. Generally, we talk about encryption, number of encryption, but maybe the attack only performs XOR operations. So you might say that this attack works when you perform 2 to the 80, when you perform 2 to the 80 XOR operations and so on, or memory accesses. So it will determine your time. The second type, resource type, is memory. This is the amount of memory or storage required to perform the attack. So sometimes you need to store some data. Maybe you don't need to work on all of the data at the same time. So data complexity and memory complexity are somewhat different, but during the attack, maybe you will need to store some values. So this is why we also need some memory. You can measure it in terms of number of blocks or gigabytes or terabytes and so on. And finally, the data. This is the amount of data required to perform the attack. So in the previous slide, we talked about non-plain text, chosen plain text attacks, and so on. So how many chosen plain text or non-plain text you require to perform the attack is actually your data type, and it will determine your data complexity. So of course, you would like to perform the attack with as little as data as you can, with as little as memory you have, and as little as time would be better for you. So sometimes we call about attacks and say that this is a practical attack, and sometimes we say this is a theoretical attack. So the difference is that if your attack requires, for instance, 2 to the 100 gigabytes of memory, then we will say that this is a theoretical attack because nobody has that amount of memory, right? So in practice, you cannot perform it, but in theory, it works. Okay. So I will come to this again. Let's focus on exhaustive search. So let's first talk about generic attacks, and this will actually determine our security upper bound. Okay, so exhaustive search attack, in this case, we are searching for the secret key. So exhaustive key search attack is the most basic generic attack that you can perform. So in this scenario, if an attacker captures one plain text and the corresponding ciphertext, but they don't know what the secret key is, they can encrypt the plain text with every possible key and check if this correct ciphertext is observed. Of course, if the decryption is somewhat better for you, you can perform the same attack by decrypting the ciphertext with every possible key and check if the plain text matches with the one you captured. So as we can see, this is like performing a brute force attack on a password. But instead of passwords, we have secret keys here. And we are going to try, in the worst case scenario, you have to try every possible secret key, right? So actually, it is enough to capture only the ciphertext in this scenario because the attacker can decrypt with every key the ciphertext block you captured and check if the obtained plaintext is something intelligible. For instance, if it is a word in maybe English or Turkish and so on. Okay, so you don't have to capture the plaintext anyway. Capturing a single ciphertext block might be enough for you to perform this attack. Okay, so this is why I will call it a ciphertext only attack right away. So the attack type is total break. You capture the secret key when you perform this attack. Data type is ciphertext only attack because capturing only a single ciphertext block is enough. Time complexity is 2 to the k encryptions or decryptions depending on how you perform the attack. But since the secret key is k bits, you have to perform in the worst case scenario 2 to the k trials, right? So this is your time complexity. Memory, you don't actually need to store anything in the memory. Data, again, it is either one ciphertext block, or if you captured both the plaintext and the ciphertext block, that will be one non-plaintext. Okay. So as you can see, in this attack tells that whatever the block cipher you are using, we can always break it by performing 2 to the k encryptions. So this is your security upper bound. You cannot design an algorithm that uses k-bit secret key, but provide more security, right? So when we talk about 128-bit security, in block ciphers, we are saying that the secret key is 128 bits. This will be different in public key algorithms because there will be better or faster generic attacks. So for instance, in an elliptic curve, if your secret key is 256 bits, it provides you 128-bit security. If you are using RSA, if your secret key is 3072 bits, it will still give you 128-bit security. Okay, this security upper bound is measured by the generic attacks that you can perform. So in our scenario now, in the symmetric key encryption, the exhaustive search attack is trying every secret key by performing a single encryption. So this is why you can always break any cipher, any block cipher, by performing 2 to the k encryptions without using any memory or requiring to capture a lot of data. So now we will see the opposite of this, okay? And I will call it a table attack, sometimes called a dictionary attack, but let's not mix them. So in this table attack, you either capture or somehow pre-compute every plaintext and corresponding ciphertext. So this means that assume that the block size is really short, for instance, 32 bits. If you listen to the communication or give a plaintext that actually contains every 2 to the 32-bit block, and if you capture the ciphertext also, this means that you already know any possible block and corresponding ciphertext block without knowing the secret key. Okay, so you store them in a sorted table, so you know every possible input and every corresponding output without knowing the secret key. So you know which plaintext block goes to which ciphertext block. You store them in a sorted table. So, for instance, since you already know all of them, for instance, you sort it with respect to the ciphertext. Whenever you capture a ciphertext, you just look at that table and see what it belongs to in plaintext. Or you can do the opposite. If you sort the table with respect to plaintext, assume that you want to forge a message without knowing the secret key, you will just look at the plaintext block and create the ciphertext, okay? But you still don't know the secret key. This is the important thing. So this attack type is global deduction, because it is not a total break. You don't capture the secret key. But the data type is non-plaintext, but then it is somewhat misleading because you have to capture every plaintext and the ciphertext. So saying it is a non-plaintext somewhat misleading, but anyway, you have to know every plaintext and the corresponding ciphertext. Time is none, because you only have to perform a one table lookup, so it is negligible. Okay. Memory, you have to store every plaintext and ciphertext block, so it is 2 to the b blocks. And data, again, you have to capture every possible plaintext. So if the block size is b bits, this means that there are 2 to the b different plaintexts, so you have to capture all of them with their corresponding ciphertext. So this way, you can still break the cipher, which means that you can understand every ciphertext and you can produce any ciphertext you want by any plaintext you are choosing. So as you can see, with respect to the previous attack, this time the time is none. And in the exhaustive search, let's go back, the time was really high, but there were no memory or data involved. So in our scenario this time, so we have a lot of data and memory, actually the highest that we can capture as data, but we don't need time. So this means that, maybe I will say it in the following slides, but let me briefly mention it here. So if you say that I found the weakness in the cipher and then break it, then that attack scenario has to perform less encryptions than this many encryptions, because we can always break it with 2 to the k encryption. So you have to give us an attack that has less time than this, but also that require less memory and less data. Okay. So if you perform an attack which requires more than 2 to the b data, which is not possible, or if you find an attack where the time is 2 to the k plus 1, for instance, then we will say that, okay, it is interesting, but it is not better than exhaustive search. Okay. So now, before moving on, now we can say that, okay, this attack requires a lot of data and memory, and this attack requires a lot of time. So can we somehow meet them in the middle? So can we do something like time memory trade-off? Okay. So the answer is yes. And these are called, as you might guess, time memory trade-off attacks. So it has many variants, many improvements, but the classical version was introduced by Hellman in 1980. So the main problem was here is that performing exhaustive search more than once is really a pain in the neck, let's say. Even if we have enough computational power to perform exhaustive search for a cipher with small key size, we have to perform 2 to the k encryptions every time to capture the key. So for instance, let's think about A51, which is the 2G GSM standard. There the secret key was 64 bits. So performing 2 to the 64 encryptions is not that hard. Depends on your computational power. If you have many GPUs, it may take months for you. Secret agencies can perform this many encryptions in days or maybe in hours. But still, in order to listen every single GSM communication, you have to perform the exhaustive search one by one, right? So if, for instance, it takes you 1 day to perform this exhaustive search, if you want to listen 1,000 communications, then you have to perform this attack in 1,000 days, right? So this is not something you want. So question is, can I perform the exhaustive search only once, but after that store some values so that in the following exhaustive search attacks, I want to do it in a faster way? And the answer is yes, and this is what the time memory trade-off attack is. So idea is to perform exhaustive search in a clever way and store only a small part of the resulting tables. I said, for example, 4 terabytes, because you can go to a store and buy a 4 terabyte hard drive, but you know the hard disks, generally the size is doubled in 1 or 2 years. So probably you can go to a store and buy an 8 terabyte hard drive, maybe 16 terabytes in store. I don't know, but maybe if they are not on the store right now, in a few months they will be. So it depends on the current technology. So idea is you perform the pre-computation part first. So you actually perform an exhaustive search, but you perform that in a clever way and store some data like 4 terabytes, 8 terabytes, depending on your storage. When performing the attack, attacker now performs less than 2 to the k operations to obtain a value that is already in the table. Okay. So there's a very nice example for A51 cipher. Again, the secret key is 64 bits. And instead of performing 2 to the 64 encryptions every single time, you first perform it, then put it in a rainbow table. But that table will be designed in a nice way. So for instance, I can create that table in a few months using my GPUs. But once I create that table, I can actually perform the future exhaustive search in a few seconds. So this means that you can listen to GSM communication in real time once you have that table. So actually, you can actually build a device. For instance, you put a single hard drive, like 8 terabytes or something, put an ARM processor to it, put an antenna to it, put it into your backpack, and while you are working, actually you can decrypt every GSM communication happening around you. Okay, so this is why A51 stream cipher will not be secure. So we haven't covered this topic yet, the topic of stream ciphers, but time memory trade-offs is one of the best examples that we can see in that cipher, because in practice it is used a lot. So sometimes secrecy agencies or police in your country may require that kind of device, or maybe they can build themselves. Okay, but for those rainbow tables, you can even create yourself, or find on the internet in a torrent or something. Depends on your choice, but it is not hard to build that kind of tables if you have computational power. Okay, another thing we need to talk about is the setting. So question is, in which kind of scenario actually you are trying to break it? So generally, we are always focusing on the single key scenario. This means that most attack scenarios consider that only one key is used during the whole communication, and the attacker tries to capture this key. So you might think that, okay, this is the only logical scenario, isn't it? But actually it isn't. So here, okay, so assume that we are talking in an encrypted way. So we chose a secret key, so we use it a lot. Maybe we exchange gigabytes of data with the secret key, and maybe the block size is really short. So we might think that, okay, we talk a lot, and maybe we send every possible ciphertext block during this communication. So now the attacker has gigabytes of data. So maybe it's a good time to change your secret key. Then you change your secret key. So this is actually what happens in practice. You have to frequently change your secret key if your block size is short, or if your mode of operation, if you are using something like CBC, using the square root of all possible data would mean that it is time to move on to a new secret key. For instance, if your block size is 64 bits, and if you are using CBC mode of operation, after exchanging 2 to the 32 blocks, it might be a good idea to change your secret key. Okay, so question is, how do I change the secret key? We have public key algorithms to exchange a secret key on an insecure channel. But you might also say that, okay, instead of trying this, let's after some time send a message to each other saying that increment our secret key by 1. Okay, an easy solution. But this means that now your first secret key and your second secret key are somewhat related, because adding 1 means actually flipping a single bit or 2, right? So the attacker, if knows this information, they don't know the both of the keys, but they know what their XOR is. Okay, so this leads us to the second scenario, the setting which we call related key. So let me read it again. Using the same key for a long time can cause information leakage, and the secret key should be changed from time to time. If the used keys have some relations, then the attacker can exploit these relations to capture some or all of the keys. Okay. So this is why when you design a cipher, you have to focus on your key schedule to see if the related keys can cause a problem. And in some designs, sometimes in lightweight designs, designers say that, okay, we are going to use this scenario in this setting, so we don't actually claim any security in the related key settings. So this kind of designs you might see. But again, having a security against related key is important, because in practice, what happens is that, for instance, let's give an example by a lightweight design called height block cipher. In the single key setting, we can break 26 rounds or 27 rounds of this cipher. But in the related key setting, we can break the whole cipher, which is 32 rounds. So most of the time, since in the related key setting, you have more information, the attacker have more capability, so you can always have better attacks in this setting than this one. But again, this is a little bit more unrealistic, because now the attacker has to know what is the relation between these keys. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about side channel analysis. This is the only time we are going to talk about this. So this slide will be the beginning and the end of this topic. But if you're more interested, you can listen to my talk in the lightweight cryptography for IoT course. Okay, because the side channel analysis is somewhat different than the previous things that I talk about, because in the side channel analysis, we are not going to break the cipher, we are going to break the implementation. That is the main difference. So side channel analysis is based on information gained from the physical implementation of a crypto system. Okay. So attacker requires most of the time a physical access to the device, because sometimes you can perform a catch or timing attack from a distance. But if you have physical access, then now you have more information, more environmental data, and so on. Okay. For example, differential power analysis measures the power consumption of a device during encryption. So assume that you have physical access to the device, and due to IoT, smart cities, and so on, we have devices scattered around where you can physically find the device and touch them. So if you have some cables, you can put on them and measure the amount of power it uses with respect to time. Okay. Information leaks depending on the power used. For instance, XOR operation requires small amount of power, but an SBox operation requires a lot more. And if some operations depends on the secret key bits, for instance, if the secret key bit is 1, and if you perform some different operation, and if it is 0 and you perform different operation, depending on the difference between these operations, sometimes in this scenario, the amount of power consumption, but sometimes maybe the amount of time they require, you can actually gain the information about the secret key bits. That is the whole idea. So also we always say that the operations should never depend on the secret key bit. But we haven't seen RSA yet, but there this happens because, for instance, depending on the secret key bit, depending on if it is 0 or 1, sometimes you perform multiplication, sometimes you perform power operation, exponentiation and multiplication. So one of them requires more time or energy. So by just looking at the histogram of this power analysis, if there are peaks, you say that, okay, the secret key here is 1. And if the peak is not that high, then you say that, okay, this is 0. So just by looking at the power analysis, you can capture all 3072 bits of an RSA key. So here you don't break the algorithm, you break the implementation. So years ago, when this area was first discovered, it was hard to get published your paper in these conferences because people thought that, okay, the algorithm is secure, the implementation is not secure, so implement it in a better way. So this has no importance, they said. But actually, it turned out that now this is the kind of security we need in practice, right? Because in real world, people start to perform side channel attacks. So it is an important area. Sometimes require a huge amount of hardware knowledge because you are going to, most of the time, attacking a small device. Because measuring the power consumption of a modern CPU will not give you enough information. You cannot distinguish that kind of XOR or SBox operations on an Intel CPU. But once you focus on a very small device, you can get this kind of information. Okay? So we are not going to talk much about this in this course, but it is important area. And due to the IoT, smart cities, and so on, it will be more important in the future. So, but to summarize, these attacks do not break the cipher, it breaks the implementation. So you must say that, okay, then I implemented in a better way. For instance, instead of performing an SBox operation as a table lookup, I can convert this SBox operation into like 10 or 20 XOR operations. Yes, so you can implement a cipher so that every operation consumes same amount of power as if you are performing an XOR operation. Yes, but this time you will lose throughput, and you will need to, have a bigger area to implement it on the hard drive. It will cause more latency. So then the question is that, can I have a lightweight cipher that is better in all of these areas? So you have good throughput, have good latency, have good security, but also, side channel resistance. So this is the area that we talk about in lightweight cryptography. So it's a strange that only a few people know about this area, by the way. So because people think that, for instance, AES is secure. So if I use AES in any place, then I will be secure. But this is not the truth, unfortunately. Okay. So now I can give a definition of a cryptanalysis attack. So I can talk about non-generic attacks, because we have seen the generic attacks like exhaustive search and table attack. So exhaustive search provides an upper bound for security, as I said, because if so we have actually upper bound by exhaustive search, but also a upper bound for data and memory by the table attack. So actually, a cipher should be so secure that the following sentence will be the case. So if the attacker captures every possible plaintext except 2, okay? So every plaintext and the corresponding ciphertext except for 2 plaintext and the ciphertext, okay? So assume that you captured all of them. then the cipher should still be secure so that the attacker should be unable to distinguish the two remaining plaintext and ciphertext. So this means that you can, have a guess with probability 1/2, but you shouldn't have any more advantage than probability of 1/2. Okay. So a cipher should be so secure that even if you capture every plaintext except 2, you should still be unable to guess which these two plaintext goes to which ciphertext. So any attack that requires less time than exhaustive search and less data and memory than the table attack is considered as the cryptanalysis of the cipher. So if these numbers are really high, we will call them a theoretic attack. But if they are practical, which means that you can, run your CPUs, GPUs for days or months or for seconds and really capture the key, then we will say that this is a practical attack. That practicality actually depends on the current technology. For instance, years ago, if you find an attack saying that this requires 2 to the 80 encryptions, we will call it a theoretical attack. But today I call it a practical attack because secrecy agencies can perform 2 to the 80 encryptions. Actually, gamers on the internet, instead of playing video games, if they try to perform an exhaustive search attack using their millions of GPUs, they can also perform a brute force attack on 80-bit secret key. So this is why that practicality depends on the current technology. But still, if you even find a theoretical attack for a block cipher, this would be enough for us to, remove it from the standards in the following future and move on to a new cipher. Okay? Because once you lose your faith in that cipher, you will say that, okay, maybe better attacks will come up. So if somebody breaks the cipher in a good way, then maybe it is time to move on. So also it depends on the scenario. For instance, if a new cipher is going to be a standard, and if we find a theoretical attack in a competition, then we directly eliminate it. But if you find a theoretical attack which is only slightly better than exhaustive search on the AES, but AES is deployed in almost every hardware and software, so we might say that, okay, this attack is not that good, so we can still keep using AES anyway. Okay, so it depends also on the scenario. Yeah, this sentence actually summarizes what I said. If the attack requires resources that are not practical, for example, 2 to the 80 terabytes of storage, which nobody will ever have in the foreseeable future, then it is called an academic break, so theoretical attack. Okay, this is what I meant. So there are a lot of non-generic attacks. For instance, in the 1980s, Biham and Chavez discovered differential cryptanalysis. So secrecy agencies knew it before, but in academia, this was the first announcement of this technique. And people modified this attack type in many different ways. So we have truncated differential cryptanalysis by Knudsen in 1994, or one of my favorites, impossible differential cryptanalysis, again by Biham Shamir, but this time with Birukov in 1998. And this attack also showed that NSA didn't know this attack because they found a very good attack on skipjack block cipher, which was designed by NSA. Okay. So Matsui came up with linear cryptanalysis in 1992. This was the first practical break of this in practice. But we have many variants like multiple linear cryptanalysis, multi-dimensional linear cryptanalysis, and so on. We can also, combine. I haven't read it here, but you can combine differential and linear cryptanalysis and have differential linear cryptanalysis, which works really good on some ciphers. So you can sometimes, combine a few of these attack types together. But there are many different attacks, and actually we keep discovering new cryptanalysis techniques. So one of my favorites is invariant subspace attack by Leander et al., which was discovered in 2011. And actually not much work has been done in this area, in my opinion. So maybe we can find more weaknesses. Similarly, in 2016, subspace trail attack was found by Grassi, Rehberg, and Ronjon. So this attack actually found the best distinguisher, I think 5-round distinguisher for AES. And later on, some people also, we combine these two attacks to get better attacks and so on. So cryptanalysis keeps improving. We come up with better techniques, and actually we find new attack types when most of the time when we focus on lightweight designs, because since they're lightweight, they're easier to understand. So working on them actually allows us to find new attack types. So this list is not complete. There are a lot of cryptanalysis techniques, but just keep in mind that we keep coming up with new cryptanalysis techniques. So if you design a block cipher years before these two new attack types, then maybe you should check if these new attack types break your cipher. Okay, so this is important. So I will finish this topic by actually giving the main theory behind the cryptanalysis attack on these non-generic attacks. So we have to think about statistics here, because these attacks, almost all of them are statistical attacks. So having a knowledge of probability theory is a good thing here. Okay, so many cryptanalysis techniques are statistical attacks, like linear cryptanalysis, differential cryptanalysis. So statistical attacks first discover a property of R rounds of a cipher. So actually you try to discover R round distinguisher. So you assume that cipher, for instance, AES is 10 rounds, but if you can come up with a 5-round distinguisher for AES, then you can use it to attack 6 rounds or 7 rounds. So this is the idea. So statistical attacks first discover a property of R rounds of a cipher, which happens with probability P0 for the cipher and probability P for a random permutation. So this is the place where you distinguish the cipher from a random permutation. But finding a distinguisher for the whole cipher is not that easy. This is why you are trying to find it for the reduced version of it. And then you will use that distinguisher to attack the full cipher or more rounds. Okay. So such a statistical property is referred to as distinguisher. A distinguisher can be used to distinguish R rounds of the cipher from a random permutation, but more importantly, an attacker can add R1 rounds to the top or the bottom of this distinguisher to attack R plus R1 rounds of the cipher. So how many rounds you can add actually depends on the design. For instance, sometimes you find R round distinguisher and only attack R plus 1 rounds. But if the design is lightweight, or depending on the situation, you can find then, for instance, 10 rounds of distinguisher, but attack 20 rounds. So it always depends on your distinguisher, the design of the cipher, the attack type you are performing on, and so on. So assume that you find the distinguisher. So how you perform the attack? So an attacker can add R1 rounds to the top or bottom of this distinguisher to attack R plus R1 rounds of the cipher by following the following steps. Since we are going to attack R plus R1 rounds, here we are assuming the cipher is R plus R1 rounds, okay? So your first aim is to gather n plaintext ciphertext pairs of R plus R1 rounds, because you cannot gain information for the intermediate values. You can capture the plaintext and ciphertext, so this is why you gather n plaintext and ciphertext pairs of R plus R1 rounds. Then, since you have a distinguisher for the R rounds, for the added R plus 1 rounds, you will try every possible key that are used in the added R1 rounds and count how many times the distinguisher is observed. Okay, so here actually you are performing partial encryption or decryption. Okay. And here we make an assumption here, and this assumption is known as wrong key randomization hypothesis. And this hypothesis says that wrong keys are assumed to act like a random permutation. Because since you are going to try every possible key, for a wrong key, once you perform partial encryption or decryption, there's no reason for you to see the distinguisher with high probability. Because for a random permutation, you were supposed to see it with probability P. For the correct one, you were supposed to see it with probability P0. Okay, so for only the correct key, we assume that we will see it with probability P0, and for all of the wrong keys, the probability will be P. So this is a hypothesis. So actually, this hypothesis is not correct, but in practice, it works. Okay. So expected value of the counters are now for n times P0 for the correct key, because the probability is P0, the probability of observing the distinguisher, and we will try m plain text ciphertext pair. So the expected value, this is binomial distribution, becomes n times P0 for the correct key. And due to this hypothesis, there will be n times P for the wrong key. So expected values will be different. So depending on this difference, you are going to determine if that key is wrong or right. So recall our exercise about fair dice and biased dice. I will talk about it at the end of the slides. Here it's actually, we observe that phenomenon here, okay? By looking at these counters, so you actually count how many times you see for every key and keep them as a counter. So by looking at these counters, we can capture the key material of the R1 runs, but this is for the only added R1 runs. So maybe you capture 20 bits of the secret key from there. So now you have to capture the remaining parts. Remaining key material can be captured by exhaustive search or performing a similar attack with a different distinguisher. So assume that you found a way to capture 20 bits of the secret key by performing this attack. So assume that the secret key is 128 bits. If you capture the 20 bits, then now you can perform exhaustive search. But since you already know the 20 bits, your exhaustive search will require 2 to the 108 bits encryptions, not 2 to the 128. So this way you are actually, performing an exhaustive, you are finding an attack that's faster than exhaustive search. So general attacks actually has two steps. In this first step, you capture key material on the R1 runs. Then you have to think about what you are going to do to capture the whole key. But for the cryptanalysis, this part is enough. Performing less operations than exhaustive search and capturing some key bits will be enough for us to say that this attack works, okay? You can leave the remaining part for the attacker. So briefly, let's talk about linear cryptanalysis and differential cryptanalysis on a single slide. The linear cryptanalysis was discovered by Matsui around 1992. This was the first experimental cryptanalysis of DES, but it required a lot of data. So in practice, data getting might be impractical, but still he produced the data himself. So this is why he could perform the attack. So this attack checks the relation of inputs and outputs as the following operation: A.P XOR B.C. Here, dot means masking of the bits. Actually, you are performing a multiplication on the bits. Okay, so the result of this operation will be a single bit, because from this part, you're actually multiplying bit by bit, and the result is XORed in itself. So this part either provides 0 or 1, and this part provides either 0 or 1. So the XOR of them provides 0 or 1. Okay. So consider, for an example, just consider the XOR of the least significant bits of the plaintext and the ciphertext. So I simplified it like this. So in theory, it should be equal to 0 with probability 1/2. And it should be equal to 1 with probability 1/2, right? There shouldn't be any reason for the least significant bits of the plaintext and the least significant of ciphertext to be related somehow. So in linear cryptanalysis, we always assume that any of this kind of masking will produce 0 or 1 with probability 1/2. But if you, due to the design of the cipher, if there is a bias from 1/2, then you can use it as a distinguisher. That is the whole idea. So for the distinguisher, this is your aim. You are trying to find a high bias in some of the bits between the input and the output. Okay. So let's move on to differential cryptanalysis. So this is our last slide for this part of the talk. So it was its first public announcement by Biham and Shamir was in early 1980s. Again, as I said, maybe we have some documents saying that Japanese already knew it during the Second World War. And again, Biham thanked in his speech, and he became an ISCR fellow. He thanked every secrecy agency who knew this technique, but didn't announce it so that he could announce to the academia, because he rediscovered it. So the first discovery, again, as I said, maybe as early as the Second World War. Idea in this case, so if we go back, linear cryptanalysis is a non-plain text attack because we are trying to find a relation between input and output. So all we need to know the plain text and ciphertext. So we don't need to choose anything here. But this will be a chosen plain text attack. So our aim is find a path, sometimes called characteristic, sometimes called differential, depending on its types, so that when the input difference is P XOR P prime. Here, P is a input, so P is one plain text and P prime is another plain text, okay? So we know this plain text. So since we know them, we also know their XOR, right? And if we find a weakness or a characteristic saying that after our rounds of encryption, output difference of the ciphertext, so C is the encryption of P, C prime is the encryption of P prime, but there shouldn't be any relation between these two ciphertexts. But if their XOR is beta with probability P is 0, which will be something high, then we can use this information to distinguish the cipher from a random permutation, and then we can convert it to attack some ciphers. So let's finish with our previous observation. When Biham and Shamir discovered this technique, they practically break some ciphers. But they realized that they cannot break this practically because this was strangely resistant to differential cryptanalysis. So they break the disk, but to break 16 rounds, around 2 to the 49 chosen plaintext were required. So this was surprising for Biham and Shamir because they were able to break some ciphers, but they couldn't break this in practical way. So this also, later on we discovered that this was due to the NSA because NSA changed the S boxes of the initial design that was designed by IBM. But this also changed the way we look at actually cryptanalysis because until this attack, all of the cryptanalysis papers in the past were saying things like, capturing a few hundred plain text and so on. So until this part, nobody used this notation as, power of twos, because in the previous generation, let's say, all of the cryptanalysis attacks were some practical attacks requiring a few thousand plain text and so on. So Biham and Shamir actually changed the game here by introducing a concept like these huge numbers, but which are, lower than the generic attacks. Okay, so this actually, explaining differential cryptanalysis in one slide, but this is very counterintuitive attack. So for students, understanding this sometimes take more than a few months. Okay, so I explained in a very simple way, but it is not that simple. Okay.